Our next guest is Geoff Pallay. Geoff is the Director of Research at Ballotpedia. I think most of you know that I'm a big fan of Ballotpedia. I think it's the best internet site for information on politics. What we're going to talk to Geoff about today is a new phenomenon, or a growing phenomenon rather, in politics, where at the time of the general election there is lack of competitiveness, a growing lack of competitiveness. The Republican may be unopposed, the Democrat may be unopposed, and this is becoming an increasing and growing phenomenon. So Geoff has done a lot of research on this topic, and we're going to drill down and see why Geoff thinks this is a problem and what we need to do to solve it. So Geoff, welcome to None of the Above.
Thanks so much for having me today, Steve.
Geoff, before we get started, perhaps you could talk a little bit about what it means to be the Director of Research at Ballotpedia. What are some of the things you do there? What is your day-to-day experience with the site?
Sure. So I've been working for Ballotpedia since June of 2010 now, so almost 4 years. And what the Director of Research position allows me to do is to focus on all of the behind-the-scenes research and the little-known facts that voters don't always have readily available for them. So what does it take to get on the ballot, or what are some original research projects that we can do specifically into, say, competitiveness in elections? And it's I've had the opportunity to work on a variety of projects at Ballotpedia, including state legislatures, redistricting, Congress, state executives. So if you like politics, it's a really exciting position to be in.
So obviously you've done some research, and you're noticing, or you've noticed for a while, you've been documenting the fact that we are lacking competitiveness in our general elections.
Yeah, that's right. It's been said that a working democracy requires contested, competitive elections, and in recent years, the trend is toward just less and less competition in elections, despite the increasing amount of money that's spent on the seemingly endless campaign cycle. And this problem is seen at both the congressional and state legislative election levels.
Well, is that part of the problem, that there is this endless spending cycle? And if you would be an opponent to take on an incumbent, you'd say, why do I want to do this? Why do I want to have to raise all this money and take on the incumbent? Is that a part of the problem from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that redistricting can contribute a lot to that, where it's pretty understood which districts are safe for specific candidates. Incumbents regularly win re-election more than 90% of the time. Incumbents run for re-election in more than 80% of the districts. So in a lot of cases, you definitely see that it's already a given. People know who's going to win, and at that point, many people think it's not even worth running in the first place.
Yeah, you mentioned redistricting. We haven't talked about that yet on the show, and it's going to be an important topic for us. But maybe you could explain briefly what redistricting is and how it plays into what you're talking about today.
Sure. So redistricting is the redrawing of census line of the congressional and state legislative district lines, and it takes place every 10 years after the census process. Who controls the redistricting process? It varies from state to state. But most of the time, it's usually the politicians themselves. And critics like to say that the problem with redistricting is that it flips the basic formula of elections. So instead of voters choosing their elected officials, what redistricting allows to happen is the politicians select their constituents. And this phenomenon, it creates gerrymandering, and every cycle it seems to just kind of get worse and worse as the elected officials draw the districts in their favor and kind of breed away competition from elections.
So you mentioned that more than 90% of the time the incumbent wins. Is this true at Congress level, state legislative level, across the board?
This is across the board, Congress and state legislatures. Specifically say, so for example, in Congress, over the past 6 election cycles, more than 90% of all U.S. House races, not only do incumbents win their races 90% of the time, but even of the other races, 90% of all elections were decided by a margin of victory of greater than 5%. So they're not even close, the elections where an incumbent might even lose. It's just a really uncompetitive environment out there right now.
So what are your numbers showing you in terms of competitiveness? How many races are there that you track, and how many of them are in fact not competitive?
Yeah, so let's talk a little about state legislature first. This is something that we pay really close attention to at Ballotpedia. It kind of started back in 2010 We were building lists of candidates of all 6,125 seats that were up for election that year. And this was, the year that the Tea Party came into national recognition. There was a lot of rhetoric going around that there was a high degree of competitiveness in elections once again. So as we're building our list of candidates, we kind of noticed that this didn't seem to be the case, at least anecdotally. So we developed a competitiveness index to try and capture this, statistically speaking. Our competitiveness index looked specifically at 3 factors. One is the incumbent running for re-election in a district. With incumbents winning re-election in more than 90% of races, a seat becomes much more likely to become competitive if there's no incumbent on the ballot. The second factor we look at is whether the incumbent is indeed running for re-election, and if so, do they face a primary challenger? The third factor, which will speak more to the competitiveness, is are there 2 major party candidates in the general election? With more than 99% of seats held by 2 major parties, a competitive race would require at least 2 major party candidates for voters to choose from. And when we looked at the data for 2010 and 2012, we were amazed to find that of the 6,000 seats up for election each year, more than 2,000 seats have only 1 major party candidate appearing on the ballot. So in effect, 1/3 of all seats in state legislatures, the election is effectively decided before voters even show up to the polls.
That's stunning. Now, is that a recent phenomenon? Has this been developing over the last decade or two? How historical have you been in your attempt to define this problem?
We haven't had a chance to go back too far beyond 2010 yet. We really hope to do that at some point in the years ahead, but it does seem to be a situation that's growing. The competitiveness seems to be on the decline, and especially right after the redistricting process. We saw a 6% increase from 2010 to 2012 in the number of seats that did not have 2 major party candidates on the ballot. So it does seem to be getting worse.
Now, I would think that people would argue that in redistricting, even if, as you said, the candidates are selecting who they want to represent, that since most of this will be new territory for them, a challenger may say, if I'm ever going to take on an incumbent, I would take on an incumbent at a time when they're trying to introduce themselves to their new district, because I kind of have an equal shot at that. But you're not seeing that happening.
Some of the data in 2012 with Congress specifically saw a little bit of that. In particular, I think with respect to some, resignations. So the example that kind of jumps out for me is Barney Frank, where he chose specifically not to run for re-election, and he made no bones about saying that the whole reason was because he didn't want to have to meet new constituents in his district that was redrawn to include something like 200,000 different residents than who he previously had represented. So I think a lot of times what happens is when incumbents see that they might have a more difficult re-election campaign, they just simply choose not to run. Dan Burton in Indiana was another example of this from the last election cycle.
Now, one of the things that I've observed, but I don't have a statistical basis to prove, and I don't know if you have any insight, is this notion that a lot of times, in order to protect the party, whether the Democrat currently holds a seat or the Republican currently holds a seat, the incumbent waits until the very last minute to say whether or not they're going to run again. Now, they've probably let the party know they're not going to run again, but by waiting so long to make that announcement, they may then preclude a challenger for stepping up because the challenger didn't have enough notice, didn't have enough time to start raising money.
Yeah, this is definitely something we've noticed. It seems to take a different shape and form in every state, but in every state we've looked at, there is some semblance of the incumbents controlling essentially the rules of the game. A couple of stories come to mind right away. In Maryland earlier this year, they altered the filing deadline for candidates. Normally it was, somewhere along the lines of March or April, and the legislators moved it up to January. The reason for that was because they admitted this, that they wanted to see prior to the session who they might be running against for election, because this would help them shape how they voted during the session on bills. They can now manipulate what they voted on just to make sure that they could protect their incumbency status. In South Carolina in 2012, hundreds of candidates were kicked off the ballot, in part because the political party themselves made the process complicated for non-incumbents, and they had to fill out essentially a second form that the political parties did not help them with, and there were tons of lawsuits, and candidates ultimately, in many cases, had to file as petition candidates just to get on the ballot at all. A third example would be in Idaho. The Republican Party tried to change the rules this past year for primary ballot access. They wanted to institute a change where any candidate would actually require specific approval from the party themselves in order to obtain ballot access. The change didn't actually go through, but these three examples kind of indicate a growing trend where ballot access is just being increasingly restricted for those not connected within the existing major political parties.
It's interesting you mentioned Maryland and the maneuvering of the dates. In Illinois, which is where I'm from, and I maintain most of my political contacts, there's been a horrendous pension problem for years. Illinois was cited as being one of the states that had the deepest pension hole to dig out of, hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yep.
And what happened is in November, the General Assembly met in what they call their veto session. And in their veto session, they did not address pensions at all. They didn't touch it. Yet 3 weeks later, the day after the filing deadline, they came back and voted on pension reform. So this goes back to what you were saying. These people who are trying to hang on to their seats want to protect what may be perceived as a vote that is not a good vote for them. So they wait until a time when they take that vote, and they know they've already locked in their job. So I find that to be particularly disingenuous. And to hear you say this is going on, in other parts of the country is it's a sad commentary.
Yeah, and that Illinois story sounds all too familiar for Illinois, and you're very familiar with it, like you said. Illinois has always stood out in my mind because of the paperclip stories, where candidates will be disqualified from the ballot because they either didn't use paperclips on their ballot application forms, or they, in some cases, used paperclips instead of staples. I mean, just the kind of most trivial reasons for removing candidates from the ballot, and it just contributes to the lack of competition in general elections.
So we have ballot access is a problem, we have funding is a problem, redistricting is a problem. How do we start to solve these issues? How can Ballotpedia help in the way they put information out to educate people on how to deal with these issues?
Sure. And I think one of the the biggest things that we can do to help is just to allow individuals, citizens, voters, people who might be interested in running to more easily obtain the information that they need to either run for office or just to become educated voters in elections. I'm sure it'll come up much more later on, but with the increasing amount of gerrymandering of the districts and with population migration and just districts in general becoming much more single party controlled, the primary becomes a much more important event, and it's often difficult for voters to even understand that primaries are important. With general election turnout as low as it is, and primary election turnout is 10% usually that of a general election, so trying to really just make it much more obvious and more accessible to get information about their elections for both voters and candidates, that'll really help a lot. At least we hope in the long run.
Yeah, one of my concerns, and we weren't supposed to be talking about it today, so I don't spend too much time because we're going to get to it, is this notion that we don't have a high turnout. Do you think part of the reason we don't have a turnout is, let's say the person wakes up on November 8th or whatever it is, this election day, and they say, well, no one's even running against my U.S. Senator, no one's even running against my congressman or woman, I don't want to get out of bed to go vote for the school board today. Do you think some of it is that there's lack of competitiveness at the top of the ballot?
Yeah, I think it definitely would appear to be that way. People are very logical and rational with their uses of time, and especially in this growing internet age, I think there's a lot of fun stuff people can do with their time. They can spend time with their family, they can work, they can read a book, they can go on the internet. And to spend 2, 3, and 4 hours at the polls, first of all, educating yourselves about the candidates and then spending the actual time going to the polls, unless they feel like they're an educated voter or unless they feel like their vote actually makes a difference, there's a good percentage of people that probably they just decide they'd rather just stay away. And that, that does seem to be, I think, growing a little bit in recent years, and I would definitely agree that's tied in part to the lack of competitiveness. And we do see that in some cases, the closer the margin of victory in an election, usually the higher the turnout, because people realize, oh, my vote might actually make a difference here.
So Geoff, this is great information. For someone who wants to go to Ballotpedia now and find out more about your studies and get some more information about this, in closing, tell them what they need to do and how they can find more background on this topic.
Sure. So you can just visit ballotpedia.org. There's a search bar that you can, search competitiveness index, and you get all of the studies that we've done specifically into state legislative competitiveness. If you click on there's a map on the home page. You can click right into a state and get access into all of our election results pages and our ballot access pages for candidates. On the right side of the home page, there will be a number of links that will, for the various projects that we cover and for ballot access. Everything's there. You can kind of get lost within the wiki for hours and hours on end, and hopefully find information to your delight about politics and elections.
Geoff, this has been great. Hopefully sometime this afternoon your site will be flooded with people wanting to know about competitiveness in elections. Thank you for your time.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for having me, Steve.